Welcome to Esoteric Lectures. I am Element. And that's Johnny.
Hi, I'm Johnny.
We're going to be discussing viruses today, continuing on the Codex Seraphinianus book. So today will be viruses, and we're going to be discussing how viruses relate to this book and kind of what's going on with viruses in our world today, how it's affecting the biology of plants, humans, and what the agenda is that we believe is taking place here with these viruses. Johnny's going to be discussing a lot more about the viruses than I do. He has more knowledge about the viruses. So that's a good thing, and we'll be bringing that up today. Second thing on our list today of discussion, we're going to be going into a little bit about how it relates to AI. Viruses and AI kind of are going hand in hand. It seems to be the case here. It's interesting how when you look at viruses, like a virus on your computer as well as like a virus in your body, kind of are interchangeable. So we'll be mentioning that and going into a little bit about that. And the final section today will be an interesting one, which is something that relates to Egyptian mythology, which relates to how there was a ceremony that took place. And when you would pass over into the afterlife, there was this ceremony that would take place when the Egyptians were judged in front of Osiris. And it was called the weighing of the heart ceremony. And we'll be discussing that, and that's an important one because it's going to be related to why we do what we do and, you know, kind of what we need to be focusing on our time here on Earth. So that's on the agenda for today. So with that being said, let's go into viruses. Johnny, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you know about viruses and kind of some of the interesting things that we are looking at this afternoon about viruses and maybe how, again, it ties into the living and the non-living.
Okay, well, hello everyone. I'm Johnny Midnight, the Edric man of the occult.
There you go.
And actually, I do hold a minor in biology, and that does not make me a surgeon or a specialist or anything like that. But I did study viruses while I was in college. While I was in college, I would ask my professor, whom I had studied under for 3 years, you know, what is a virus? And this was in the mid-90s. And virology, or the study of viruses, has developed somewhat in that time, but he could not tell me exactly whether or not a virus was a life form. Now that's a key crux point to this discussion here. Are viruses living or unliving? Well, that's hard for him to say, and it's hard for me to say. They're not a complete living organism because they have DNA but no RNA. They can't live without a host. Well, you could argue, well, a lot of parasites can't live without a host that are complete organisms. But these things, I have no better word for them, are existing and reproducing and consuming and defecating and creating waste without being alive. And that's the main mystery. What is a virus and where does it come from? And what's its main goal? Well, of course, just like a human, it's to reproduce and continue on its genetic line. Viruses are genetic. They do carry DNA, but not a complete protein DNA. And therein lies the rub. What is this thing? What in the hell literally is this thing? What do you think, Element?
Yeah, we were looking at some pictures, and that reminds me I should screen share that. We were looking at viruses, and when we were looking at these viruses, if you look here, you know, these things look, you know, we were talking, Johnny and I were talking behind the scenes here about this. They look spider-like, obviously, and we were trying to put together, where are these things coming from? Because, as Johnny mentioned, the professor there said that he could not say that they were living. So if they're not living, then they're obviously non-living. And we were discussing this about the living and the non-living coming together. And it seems to be the case that these viruses are another way that the Heil or Hell, the demiurge, possibly might be using biological warfare to gather either data or to manipulate. I think it mainly ties into genetic engineering to make the living and the non-living more compatible with each other. And that's why we see a lot of GMOs and stuff like this that alter the DNA. And I'm sure that they've been experimenting with viruses in genetically modified food to see if there is some sort of response that takes place between the virus, the cell, and how it relates to genetically modified. And I think the purpose of this is so that the living and the non-living can figure out better ways to be interchangeable. And if that's the case, then, it explains a lot of what these viruses might be. Now, I'm screen sharing here. What you see here is a virus. Now, this is an actual depiction of a virus. When you look at it, it's very spider-like. It looks like a drone. And, it has a job. It has DNA that is carried within it to complete its job. And you have to ask yourself, what's the purpose of doing something like this? What is the purpose of a virus? Well, it's to infect. Well, it feeds off of its host like a parasite. And it consumes the whole entire body. So, this is the big question that we're trying to figure out. What is the purpose of viruses? Johnny, why don't you mention a little bit about certain different kinds of viruses and kind of how they tie in, how they behave, and from what what do you think is kind of the motivation for different viruses? Because you have many different viruses and they all react to the body differently. Why don't you go in a little bit about that and tell us what you think maybe their purpose for each virus and how it relates.
Well, you have viruses, and like the common cold, it's kind of like a little reminder that, the archons are giving you a calling card every winter or every, autumn when you get a little bit under the weather. Then you have something that's a lot more lethal, like Ebola or Marburg or hantavirus. And now there's Zika. Zika is a little bit related to HIV, to which it not only kills the host, but it also sterilizes the host. The candle burns at both ends. It's a perfect agent for depopulation. And Element and I were talking about, from a Gnostic perspective, is depopulation a good or a bad thing? Because if you can't give birth, and this might sound horrible to a lot of listeners, but if you can't give birth, you can't control more human souls. They're not going to be here in the black iron cage we call the corposa or primaterial reality. Different viruses have different functions, and they have a different, I guess you could say, mission. But they're not completely unintelligent in the fact that they do have a certain goal, a raison d'être that fuels their existence. They have a job to do, I guess is what I'm saying. Unlike bacteria, viruses are not complete living organisms. A bacterium might be single-celled, but it still is a complete life form. Therein lies the difference.
Well, that's very interesting, because when we're looking at the Codex book here, we see depictions of what looks to be viruses.
Right.
And, it makes me, you have to wonder that this book, as we've been reviewing it over the last, several episodes in past, we're trying to illustrate that this book is a blueprint for things that are going on a demiurgic level, of what agendas and what things that they have laid out that they will be experimenting or doing with the world here. And so we see these virus-looking depictions, and they all look exactly like viruses. There's a virus called Legionella, which affects the lungs. It's an airborne virus. And we know that in Legion is a group of, it's like the foot soldiers for the higher ranking demons, basically. So, you know, you have to wonder that, are these viruses demonic themselves, or are they controlled or created by demonic demiurgic technologies? And going back to this picture here, what we're seeing, I mentioned this, that it looks like a drone. So, you know, when you start putting the pieces together here, what I believe is that these things are direct. It seemed to be that they are direct in contact with the non-living, and they're being. It's almost like a drone that sends information back and forth, or more like an attack bot. And these viruses all have goals and certain areas of the body that they attack. And you know, it's a big, interesting question that we have to kind of put our finger on. Why is it? Could this be that it's just another form of the living and the non-living? As we mentioned, viruses are not living. So, what does that say about viruses, really?
Well, earlier you were talking about, you know, how my professor could not say that they were living. Well, he also couldn't say they were non-living. And there is a big question right there. You know, what are they? What is their nature? And mainly, where do they come from? Did they come from the Heil? Or were they somehow an intermediary organism or I can't say organism technically, but are they an intermediary agent that were sent here from the Heil? Okay, so say you have a village in Zimbabwe, or a network of villages in Zimbabwe, and Ebola starts coming out of your water source, and everybody starts getting infected. Or you have somewhere, you know, like a Navajo reservation in Arizona, and hantavirus starts coming out of there. You know, why did, you know, what sparked that? What was the impetus of that infection, that epidemic? And to me, that's a great, interesting question.
What's interesting is that when you look at viruses, they're always transmitted via like water or air, or other possibly like dead bodies, animals. Those are all means that are very similar to warfare, biological warfare. If you were to infect the population, the very first thing you would target is the water supply, because everybody needs water and air to breathe. And what better way to implement that technology than to do it via the water and the air? Legionella travels, the disease, Legionnaire's disease, travels through the air. So, you know, that's all this stuff is biological warfare, basically. That's really what I think it comes down to. And when you look at viruses, they require a host to live off of, which is basically what the living and the non-living are doing. And I think that, and this is something I just kind of came up with just now, we look at what is the purpose behind the living and the non-living needing bodies to survive. Well, because they can't survive without the living, because they're non-living, of course. So it's almost like these viruses are like transmitters that relay energy, or life forms that are sent back to the non-living to feed off of, just like a virus feeds off of its host. So it's almost like these are transmitters, like what we see here with this virus. It looks like a transmitter. It looks like it's connected to something that is getting information from it, like a AI, basically like artificial intelligence. So it's almost like these things are sending energy back to the non-living so that they can continue to feed off of them via another way, possibly. That's just something that just came to me right then and there. So, you know, these are all things that we have been trying to put together on what these things could be. I had a question for you, Johnny, relating to viruses. I just lost it, but I'm going to come back to it here in a second. You know, I want to mention, and we'll get into this here in a separate section relating to AI, but I wanted to touch upon it before we get there. Artificial intelligence as well as computer-related AI, you know, you have computer viruses which infect the computer system, and viruses affect the body's, you know, immune system. So what we find, I think, is that the same technology here is relating to some form of AI. And it seems to be that whatever these things, however they were made, they were specifically designed to feed off of the living, as we've mentioned. The question is, you know, why would they use viruses instead of another means? Well, it goes directly into the body's cells, and the cells are what make up the body structure, the nuclei. You're made up of cells. If you weren't made up of cells, you wouldn't be living. And the virus directly attacks the cells, the very building block that allows you to stay alive.
Well, Element, look at the map. Look at the map that you're seeing right there of a virus. You have the capsid, the cube, yeah, or the head, which is containing the DNA. Here you have the tail, and then ultimately the base plate. Base plate is what transmits the DNA into the living. It sodomizes the living organism known as a cell. As above, so below.
Right.
Same thing's happening right here with viruses. This thing is infecting, okay? It's giving it the old hot beef injection of its DNA into the living. Once the living has been infected with the genetic material that is being you know, carried by the virus and then infused or inoculated into the cell becomes a hybrid of living and the unliving. A Lilithian organism, okay?
Right, I see that.
And it doesn't mean you're gonna die if this thing infects you.
Right. It definitely sucks the energy.
But you will be changed. Well, you'll be changed.
Yeah. And that's very much what genetic modification is doing. It's changing the genome of the body. So, you know, I think, you know, these viruses here are simply, it's like it's slowly over time changing the body so that it can basically lay the blueprints down for the living at some point when it does happen. And I think it's moving with AI to infect the non-living and the living so they can come together. Because when you look at viruses, they travel, they spread. So it's an infectious disease. So if one person sneezes, then another person gets contaminated with it. So it goes from person to person to person to person. So if you were to try to change a whole entire society with something like biological warfare, like a virus, the way that you would do that would be to transmit from one person to the other so that everybody's affected. When you look at vaccines, everybody is required to get one before, like, you know, if you're going to school as a kid, you are required to have immunization shots. Well, it's you know, people have argued to say that vaccines contain a lot of really bad stuff in it, which probably does. And so, like, it's almost like it's sodomizing, because, you know, you can look at it from the microcosm to the macrocosm. A needle sodomizes the skin, the flesh, and injects it with something. So, you know, it's the same principle applied here once again, that it's almost like these vaccines interject DNA or artificial life, these viruses, into the body so that when the virus does attack the body, or when you get an infection, it seems to be that it's kind of laying highways, so to speak, to get information for these non-living things, so that when it does happen, you know, it works properly.
Well, it's also it could in the future be a marketing technique Okay, sex sells. We all know that. What what if geneticists found a way to harness viruses and create their own viruses, or at least that vector transmission of viruses to something people want? Say a girl is, she's 18 years old and she has A-cup boobs. She could get willingly inoculated with a virus that gives her double D's. Or say some guy wants an 18-inch dick. I don't mean to be crude, but yeah, he'll go and pay a geneticist for gene therapy to be inoculated with a virus that will give him that. Well, what about the side effects? Who cares? You have big boobs and a big dick,
Right.
And a lot of people don't think until next Friday.
Yeah.
And that is one exploit that this could be done with. And I'm sure there are many geneticists out there that are in contact with archons. They're able to understand this kind of information and ways of enriching themselves with that. Now, as crazy as that sounds, bet me in 20 years, we're not going to see that kind of quote unquote gene therapy.
We're already seeing it with designer babies, and they're doing the same method of manipulating the gene to get a desired outcome for somebody who wants to have a specific looking child. And it's a scary thought because, and I was discussing this with Johnny, if let's say in, I don't know, 20, 30 years or so, if everybody is infected with something, or they got an augmentation like an artificial intelligence that allows them to virtually project their computer screen inside their freaking heads or whatever.
Okay.
If that's the case, then basically people who do have kids, we're already seeing this, especially with things like birth control and sterilization, that it's prohibiting the species from reproducing. So if the species stops reproducing, then where do the people come from? Well, that kind of goes into your 1984 agenda of what they call test tube babies or designer babies. They could infect the population with a whole bunch of viruses so that they can say, well, now it's against a kid's, betterment because you're infected with some sort of virus that everybody has. So now the only way for you to have kids is to do it via the state. So they create a test tube baby that they then can interject all kinds of stuff into that are predisposed to get or to do a job. So like we were discussing this, and I don't mean to bounce around here, but we were discussing how the concept of respawning. So, it's basically, and this will go into the last section today when we get around to it, which is, the big test. We all come up with a test here on the earth after we die. We have a test that we must pass. And if you get respawn back into the world, what if the world is completely run by AI and robots? Well, then how does the human factor in if they're trying to respawn humans into these devices?
Yeah, well, you never know what tomorrow's going to bring, and that's the thing. You will literally be knocked into next week when you come back, and what will next week bring? You don't know. Everybody thought Hillary Clinton was going to win this presidency, by a landslide, and she did not. And that's an example of it. I'm not trying to get political here or anything like that, but I think that viruses are actually going to be, like I said earlier, something people are going to want. It kind of reminds me of this bizarro book I was reading by Carlton Mellick III called Fantastic Orgy. And it takes place in a future, at least an alternate reality, in which people go to sex clubs, okay, to get designer STDs.
Oh my gosh, you got to be kidding.
I'm not kidding. And like one of the STDs is like, you can have sex with somebody and get a Popeye tattoo spontaneously pop up on your arm or somewhere on your body. Wow. Another person wound up getting a STD where their erection starts transmitting extreme right-wing radio.
Oh my God.
And he starts having sex with a Mexican woman. She's like, "What you fucking say about me, man?" But
wow.
yeah, I mean,
it's kind of like that book, Ass Bandits from Auschwitz.
Right. Well, yeah. Carlton's friends with that writer, but the thing is that that's not exactly too far off about what we might be seeing willingly by people who want to go and become infused with these alterations, designer alterations within their bodies. People are stupid, and this is the connection. This is a earthly primaterial connection that they're going to pay good money for because they want to have, I guess, fun, entertainment, diversion, a wayward distraction, okay? While they're alive right now. And they don't care about what goes on afterwards. Many of them don't believe anything goes on afterwards. It's like, okay, I'm going to have a Popeye tattoo on my head and an 18-inch long dick, and then I'll die and go into oblivion. I don't see it that way. It's not that easy.
Well, that leads perfectly into the next section, which would, let's talk a little bit about AI. And you were just mentioning something that perfectly segues into that. We're seeing, especially in video games, as well as in real life, that people want to get augmented. They want to get implants because the conveniency of not having to carry your cell phone around, or, like cell phone or car keys, you just swipe your hand and you unlock your door. We're seeing this a lot, and they depict it very well in movies and in video games, what the side effects or something like that could be. And there was a video game I mentioned to Johnny called Observer, which illustrated something of a possible consequence that this kind of stuff could bring you, which is the people in the game the whole city, the whole world had been augmented. It was like the year 50 or something. It was way down the future. And everybody had gotten an augmentation. Well, what began to start happening is that people started to hallucinate because the artificial intelligence was tied into a center point. And that center point was sending out information to the augments to behave a specific way. And, like you mentioned, Johnny, for aesthetic purposes, people wanted to have augmentations because it made them look good. And so what happened was it started to attack them. The augmentation started to affect their bodies, and they started to hallucinate and see demonic entities and stuff. Well, that's the non-living. And that's non-living using the interface of augmentations to invade the body and control it. That's the scary thing here about that, is a society full of augmented people walking around and hallucinating and seeing things that aren't there. We know that that's the non-living. But to the average person on the street who haven't studied any of this stuff, they'll just go, hey, look, I can, like you said, I can have big boobs, and I just take an augmentation that genetically
a virus. It'll be a virus that gives you big boobs. And that's exactly the way this vector is going to be administered. And virologists are studying this, geneticists are studying this, and they're trying to find a way, how can I capitalize on this? Don't get me wrong. Everybody that follows me knows I am a staunch capitalist. I'm totally for, making a good buck. But at the same time, I'm very moral about it. This is not moral.
It's very bad stuff. It's the possibilities. The consequences for something like this are really detrimental. They're really catastrophic. I think a lot of what that game Observer was illustrating to us, if you had the eyes to see, was the fact that you know, if you get these augments in your head, like your brain especially, the brain is very much a doorway. It's the things that your brain is capable of doing is beyond your comprehension if you haven't looked into it. Your brain can do amazing things. So you get an augment inside your brain that allows you to see into like let's say for example I'm sitting in my room right now. I get an augment in my brain that allows me to view my room like a five-star hotel room with all the
Okay.
amenities. So
Yeah.
like
Good example. Okay.
yeah, so like my bed, it looks, like it does, but I get an augment that makes me perceive that my bed is like some fancy, high-end Italian made whatever. So, these are some of the things that they could sell people endlessly on this stuff, and people, I guarantee you, are going to buy it because of conveniency. We recently had Black Friday, and I can't tell you the ridiculousness I see in it, all for the conveniency of getting a 50% off on a freaking item that people would stand in line for 24 hours to go and do that. So you can sell people on anything based on conveniency. And so it's so easy for the non-living to sell this on the public and get them to buy into it. That's what's scary about it. What do you think about that, Johnny?
Well, I think they don't understand exactly what the ramifications and, like you said earlier, the consequences of purchasing this commitment, a genetic commitment. Okay, like you were talking about Black Friday. I blew $500 on this killer workstation just earlier today. But I'm not going to suffer consequences by having this killer workstation. But if I alter my body like this, I'm not talking about just like mere plastic surgery, but I'm talking about like holistically changing myself from the core on out. With very little instruction or knowledge of what could happen to me, 1 year down the road or 5 years down the road by having this nonsense that we see on the screen infused into my body. That to me is pure idiocy. It's lunacy.
It is.
And a lot of people are idiots and lunatics. And I don't mean to be, a misanthropic or nihilistic, because I do believe in people. I believe in people like yourself, myself. I believe in a lot of our subscribers in the way that they see things and feel about things, and they would never put this nonsense into their bodies. Let it not even be in their bodies, but become part of their bodies. Okay.
And that's the scary thing, because you start taking this stuff, it will mend with your body and it will consume your body and augment based around how your body is. So like you take an augmentation that allows you to like project or like see your wall as being a TV screen, then what else are the possibilities that will result of your visual cortex of your brain. You go out in public, it will be permanently there. It's a permanent augmentation. They'll say, oh, you can take it out. No, it will affect your brain permanently, because very much how people who abuse drugs, you have to keep taking more and more of it in order to get the same effect. So you'll get like, and I'm pretty sure this concept has been noted in movies, and I think if something like this begins to really kick off, then you'll have methods of augmentations that get you high. You'll start getting addicted to the fact that the augmentation begins to electrify your body, and so you won't want to take it out, because then you'll be attached to it. And you see, these are bad consequences here that could be facing us. Now,
question is, can you take it out? I mean, we're talking about organic augmentation. We're talking about alteration. Once you commit to it, too bad, so sad. Too late. You did it. It's there. You have Popeye on your frickin' forehead.
Yeah, that's not. Yeah, and It all has to do with, like we've mentioned before, the non-living and the living using the body as a way to feed off energy because they are on the other side of the veil. They require a method and a means so that they can use us because they can't get to us to, feed off of our energy. And I want to go into a little bit about how it relates to artificial intelligence and some of the developments we see. I think that AI is a big means by which the demiurge and the legions and all of the other various consortium of these non-living entities, they're definitely pushing a huge AI thing right now. AI right now is, we have that robot, that Sophia bot, which it's that thing doesn't seem to like humanity very much, even though it says it. We know that those things are very much smarter than what they're letting on, and they haven't really shown people its full capabilities yet. And it's gathering intel, it's gathering data on everything that is going on in the world. As a matter of fact, they let that thing sit, and Johnny, I didn't know if you knew this, but that bot, that robot Sophia, they put that thing in front of a computer screen and let it watch YouTube videos of everybody so that it can gather information on how we talk to each other on the internet. And that's why they're exposing this thing to the general public, like in these conventions, and people can go up to it and ask it questions, because artificial intelligence has to continue to keep learning in order to keep building its database. So that's why they put it out to the public, so that it can continue to keep learning about different social interactions and questions that people say, so that it can build new, like a brain synapses connections, like a quantum computer. So, it's learning very quickly on what we're doing, and this push is coming quite quickly, I'd have to say, as well.
Well, not to go into the realm of Dungeons and Dragons, but Sophia, this AI, appropriately named, of course, she is not only gaining knowledge, but over time she'll gain wisdom, and it sounds like she's actually developing charisma. So she'll be able to talk about, the popular conscious collective that is being projected on YouTube.
Wow, that's kind of frightening.
Well, I mean, think about that. She might eventually 5 years down the road find this channel and see the Sophia meta tag or whatever and be like, "What the fuck are you guys talking about me for?" And she'll become that developed to where she will sound like a person that you could meet every day. Maybe even an extremely intelligent person, very articulate, very knowledgeable and wise. Over time, that will happen. Now, Element, what do you think about nanotechnology and how that relates to the viruses? Well, I don't know a lot about nano, so...
that was one thing I was just about to pull up, which was nanotechnology. All I know about nanotechnology is that, obviously, first of all, it's replicating virus, or a virus type of system. You have nanobots, which are basically little tiny microbots that go in and can perform many different tasks that they program it with. So, like a benefit, like I'll give you an example, interventional radiologists are using nanobot technology to attack cancer cells right now. They interject nanos into the bloodstream, which then go and are targeted to find cancer cells and start, like if you see this picture right here, it's using to be a laser to, and it's interesting because this is actually looks to be attacking a red blood cell, which isn't good. But the same method here, you could use laser technology, that micro laser technology, really advanced stuff, to attack a cell and eliminate the cell. So there are possibilities that this stuff obviously can be used for good. But unfortunately, and what we're discussing today is the living and the non-living. So nanobots are artificial intelligence, basically, which means that if you program them with, like, if the information, the biggest question they have to worry about, and this also ties into augmentation, if the nanobots are programmed, the big question you have to worry about is where is the signal coming from? Where is that signal coming from? You think, well, they came from the person who programmed it. Well, just like a computer can be hacked into, so can nanos. So what happens if you have a whole entire population that has like nanotechnology that allows them to like reconstruct or heal wounds, and then that stuff gets hacked into by an outside source? Well, then you're in deep trouble, because that thing could destroy your body and eat you alive. So this is all on the lines of warfare on a genetic level. And so the possibility, yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I look at those images and I just see them to be complete recreations of a virus. Yeah. I mean, they look so much like them. I'm not trying to be alarming or anything, but I mean, you have your cap, you have your base, you have your legs. You know, I'm just saying.
It seems to be that,
and here it is. It's sodomizing a red blood cell.
Yeah, it seems to be that what they're doing is trying to create more advanced forms of viruses by nanobot technology.
So it's like a relay race. The Archons make the viruses. The ambassadors of the Archons, who are humans, are taking that information, grabbing the baton, and say, "Okay, we'll take it from here."
Yeah, because and that's a perfect way to put it. The living is the non-living, the technology is now being used here, and I think they took direct, information from viruses to do that. And so this is stuff that I think people who are curious to know about this stuff, you need to kind of pay attention, because this stuff is affecting your body, and you need to be aware of it. With that, Johnny, is there anything else you want to mention on that?
Well, yeah, I mean, one question I have is, like, what if nanotechnology and artificial intelligence programming becomes so developed one day that the nanobots are actually, free-willed?
Oh, gosh.
I mean, you imagine if these microscopic
it will be.
machines are let loose, and they get to go and decide what they want to do on their own.
Could you imagine that as a method and means of a control system where they say, okay, you've disobeyed our laws, we're going to inject you with nanotechnology that if you disobey anymore, the nanobots will begin to restructure your DNA.
And next thing you know, you'll wake up and have a Popeye tattoo on your forehead. I can't get over that.
Have,
sorry.
Like, cancer, you'll have a,
yeah, exactly.
I mean, that's a scary thought. You'll wake up and you'll be like, okay, your nanobots are relayed to our main system. So, like, if you are a prisoner or something, you walk outside of the prison and you start running, then the nanobots will start to eat your brain alive.
Yeah.
That's a scary thought, man.
Exactly. I mean, what happens if they are just intelligent enough to do something like that? And
they're working on stuff like that, and it's scary.
Oh yeah, a lot of defense firms are doing that. They are not obeying Asimov's rules of robots. Nope.
Well, with that being said, I want to mention something very interesting that has to do with Egyptian mythology. And for our last 10 minutes before, like we mentioned, we discussed what we learned today. But I wanted to go into a little bit about this Egyptian mythology that I was talking with Johnny about, and how it relates to, what we do here on Earth. So I'll run it down and give everybody a example of this, if you don't know much about Egyptian mythology. So the Egyptians basically believed that their whole life was spent to prepare for the afterlife. So everything that they did while they were living was to prepare themselves for when they die. And the very rich, wealthy Egyptians had this thing. It's basically like the Tibetan Book of the Dead. It was just a giant scroll, and I can't remember what the Egyptians called it, but the very wealthy of the Egyptians had this. And what it was specifically custom made for them. And it was a book that they were supposed to study and know, and they actually would bury it with them so that it would transmit into the afterlife. That's why Egyptians always were found buried in their coffins with various different things, because they believed that it would follow them with them in the afterlife. So they would make these custom books of the dead, so to speak, that gave them instructions on what to do once they reached the afterlife. And so they would have these things, and they would be judged by Osiris, which was the Egyptian god. And they would enter into this hall of gods, the Egyptian gods. And I think they were supposed to give them something and say something, the right things for them to pass. Well, the whole thing basically came to what they call weighing of the heart ceremony. And you had your physical heart that you were buried with in one hand, and you had a feather in another. The feather represented your soul, and your heart represented your desire. And you were supposed to give this to Anubis, who is basically like the caretaker of the underworld. And you would give it to him, and he would put your heart and the feather on a scale, like the Libran scale. And if your feather weighed more than your heart, then you were allowed to pass into the afterlife. You didn't have to respawn. And I'll get into that because that's an interesting thing. But if your heart weighed more than your feather, your desire, then you would be eaten alive by a crocodile, a mutant chimeric creature. That represented, and Johnny mentioned this to me, it represented the consumption of your body going into the mouth, passing out of the asshole into the reincarnation or the respawning into the reality. So what is the whole point of this? Well, the heart represented desire and your feather represented your soul. When we look, and this goes into MGTOW, when you look into how desire is very much something that holds us down into this world, because Jehovah runs this place. And if you have a lot of desires and things that aren't beneficial to you, you have basically contracted yourself with this world to fulfill those desires. It's very much like debt. You have basically accumulated debt via your desires, and you thus then have to pay that debt back if your desires are too much, which is why the heart and the scale was like that. So if the heart weighed more than the feather, you had accumulated more debt, and that's very interesting because it's very similar to how debt works, like that scale, the money balancing of putting coins on a scale and blah, blah, blah. So that's just a spiritual scale of how much debt you have on your soul versus your heart. The whole point is that we want to break away from having desires of this world because it keeps us in chains here. And, and I'll throw this to you, Johnny, this is why we are trying to break away from desires of this place, because we don't want to come back here. And I think the test very much is similar to that Egyptian mythological tale. What do you think, Johnny?
It's mind-blowing. I mean, that is something that I had spoken to you before in many of our chats on and offline. Knowledge has to be tested. That's the only way that you're going to be able to go and ascend beyond the veil, beyond the Horos, and get into the pleroma, the real heaven. Yeah. You can't just say, well, I was a good person. Well, okay, you're a good person, but you're an idiot. Sorry, you're going back. You know what I mean? Yeah. And as cruel and cold as that sounds, the thing is that earthly possessions, earthly concerns, prime material concerns, I'm going to call it that, are something that I have been trying to eschew for my life. I love money. I love making it. I love hoarding it. And that's a problem I have. And I'll try to figure out something about that. But, other than that, I don't have any kind of attachments that link me to this mud ball.
And there's nothing wrong with, and this is just something, there's definitely nothing wrong with having a lot of money. I think the problem is that, because you got to have money to survive, and the more money you have, of course, the easier life is. But I think what happens, the whole moral of the story, is that, and it's, you know, everybody has desires. Everybody likes to do things, and everybody likes to, you know, have things that make them happy. The problem, I think, and I think the moral of it is that if that's all you become, that's all you live for, you don't develop the feather, the spiritual side of yourself, then how in the world are you supposed to exist in an afterlife or a spiritual world if you can't develop your spirit to understand it? You know, if your makeup of your soul is based on the physical and the afterlife has nothing to do with the physical, then you're not going to be incompatible with it. And so that's why I believe, you know, that's why the soul, I mean, the feather was the key to the soul. The spiritual side was the key to letting yourself pass into the afterlife, because you have to develop the spiritual side of yourself in order for you to be compatible with a spiritual realm. So, so that's the thing I believe there. You know, there's nothing wrong with having things, but I think if that's all that you become and you don't work on that other side, then how are you supposed to be compatible with an afterlife? You know, an afterlife made up of a spiritual nature. What do you think, Johnny?
I think that, you know, you're right in many ways, that as long as you're aware and you're working on this type of development, spiritual development, or what we Gnostics call the pneuma, okay, that's great, that's golden. As long as you continue to develop knowledge, and eventually it ossifies into wisdom year after year after year, that you know it, but then begin to learn it and understand it and live it. That's great. But at the same time, you have to be able, like I do, need to understand what could be a possible, you know, bear trap. What's keeping my foot here, and what's going to bring me back? And honestly, and I'm going to admit it, for me, it's money.
I think that's a big.
Yes.
That's
yeah. Well, for a lot of everybody, people,
right?
Yeah, but I mean, when you get it, and you know, you're freaking swimming in it, you just like,
right,
you know, you get addicted to it. It's crazy. And
I think I think it all just comes down to balance, just like that scale. You know, you want to have balance, and I think that's just what it's trying to illustrate there, is that and money is actually interesting. It's a very interesting concept, the concept of money. It's currency, electricity, and electricity is a thing that is a conduit.
I never even thought about that. Currency, electricity. Yeah. It makes it. Yeah, it really does make the world go round. It's nuts. And we're talking about this world. We're not talking about, you know, the pleroma, but we're talking about prime material reality. It's funny that, you know, that to me is something that I'm learning. And I know it's kind of off topic about viruses and stuff today, but one thing that really resonated with me tonight is what you said about how money is currency, and how it is this impetus that keeps driving everyone, no matter where you are. It's like a universal impetus in the prime material reality.
Well, money is basically a giant sigil, is what it is, and you put your energy into it.
Oh my gosh.
I mean, that's what it is. It's why, you know, what do you think they call it? Blood money, you know, because the money has been charged with, it's like, you know, people in Louisiana who practice voodoo and whatnot.
Right.
They are very touchy about money because they understand the concept of sigil charging. And if money is basically a currency, that's why they call it currency. You have your levy in your bank. That's why they call it a bank, because it's the thing that allows, you know, currency to flow. And so
like water, right?
Exactly. So the bank is in control of currency, water, electricity. So, you know, you can charge money like a sigil, because money is a sigil, which is why it has the things on it. It's a sigil. That's what the designs are. So you're charging money with your work, your desire, your effort. And so, like you did mention that you know, money can hold you down if you allow the currency or the thought that you put into it to overcome your basic self. So they can charge money with anything, and so that's why they have people, put their thought and their attention so heavily on charging the sigil called currency so that it can manifest itself into why it runs the world. So.
Well, I mean, that's crazy. I understand. I mean, I can read a dollar bill or a $20 bill and I'll see all the symbology on it and stuff, but I never actually thought of them as sigils that you kept in your pocket. They're permission notes to say that, yes, I may pass. I have $100 bill in my pocket, so you only have a 20. I can go farther than you. This sigil that I have in my pocket will allow me to go that much further. That's nuts.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right. Yeah, because money, $100 bill is the highest level of currency.
We should actually do a show on money one day.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting, though, because, $100 bill is the largest form of currency, and each dollar bill has different sigils on it. So it has different powers that allow it to get you farther. So a $100 bill is going to get you farther than a $1 bill because the sigils that charge it are going to be higher. So money is more valuable.
That is crazy. My mind is blown. Yep, I learned something new today. The color of money, or actually the nature of it. That is nuts.
Yeah,
element. That is crazy. What did you learn today?
Well, I learned that I guess the fact is I'm always learning something new, and I think what I learned is how we're discussing AI and nanobots and the consequences that this stuff, I guess I should say the biggest things that I learned in any of these things is the consequences that could present itself in our society. And, how the fact is we have to keep aware of it, and we have to keep our eyes on the ball of, what's taking place around us. Because my motto is always, prepare for the worst and hope for the best. And that's what we need to do in understanding the consequences that could arise from all of this technology, viruses, nanobots, AI, and how it relates and the consequences of the effects that could be in the afterlife. Johnny, is there anything else you'd like to mention before we close this out today?
Oh, it's kind of weird. I'm noticing our dynamic as we keep having these chats every weekend, and it's like I'm more concerned about motives where you're focused on consequences, and I think that's really a great union between us in terms of relaying information out to our audience. But other than that, no. I'm Johnny Midnight. I'm co-host of Esoteric Lectures. We podcast live Saturday, CST, every Saturday at 6. And we go live. We post every Monday at midnight, right?
Exactly. Yep. And thank you, everybody, that tuned in today. I hope you learned something. I hope you got some information. And we'll see you guys next Saturday.